Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief of RCR Wireless News. Thanks for joining us today. Today I'm joined by Bill Ho with 556 Ventures to talk a bit about spectrum auctions, just the craziness going on with the FCC in terms of Auction 97. So Bill, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Hey, always happy to talk to you.
Great. Well, so the big topic I think we want to cover is the spectrum auction, which is somehow still dragging on. It began back in mid-November. I was very excited about it when it started. I'm still somewhat excited about it, but at this point, we're looking at just a handful of bids per day. The total, obviously the total bids are up to almost $45 billion, which I think most would say is a screaming success for the FCC. But I guess your general view of kind of this auction, what's kind of gone on with it. I mean, obviously the amount of money being spent is more than I think most expected, but obviously for the FCC, it's a nice little bonus. But what's your general view of kind of what's gone on with this auction and how it's kind of progressed over the past almost 2 months now?
Well, there's two things. I think one is the amount of money spent. The rosy projections went anywhere from the high teens to maybe $20 billion. It's now nearing 45. So I think it's a win for the taxpayers and the government, and so that's one thing. Good for the U.S. coffers, right? The second thing is that it sets the stage for the broadcast auction. So the fact that it has high earning potential for the spectrum holders, potentially in 600, it's good for them in that, hey, there's some serious money to be made, and the carriers who want it are willing to pay top dollar for it. So, I mean, at a minimum, it sets a kind of a reference bar for what can be in 600.
Yeah, yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, it shows too that this spectrum that's up right now. I mean, the AWS-3 auction, the spectrum, the 1.7, is a pretty valuable spectrum. I mean, I think in general, people always thought of that mid-range spectrum as being good, but not the top dollar kind of spectrum. But it seems like obviously that operators are putting a pretty good value on this spectrum, and it seems like for all these dense markets, it does play in pretty well. So I mean, obviously, this spectrum has shown that whether it's a spectrum or not, but obviously operators are willing to spend the money on good spectrum almost no matter where it's at.
Yeah, so if you and we know that it's blind, we don't know who's going to be the winners. But I think the people who are naturally gravitate to this because it's so close to the AWS One stuff is whoever the owners of AWS One are. So that's T-Mobile, that's Verizon, and to a lesser extent AT&T because they don't have national. So the fact that it's so close to it, they can either aggregate, do carry aggregation to increase that pipe. And especially in highly congested areas. I think we were talking that New York is such a highly prized market simply because it's a pretty dense market, right? I don't know what is it these days? Is it over 9 million people or?
Yeah, I think the whole area there. I mean, it's like northern New Jersey, New York City. It's 10 million people living in that area. So.
Right. So anything to alleviate congestion, add capacity to that very, very dense market is a good thing for all the people, all the carriers who operate there. So it validates that the larger markets. I saw L.A. and Chicago. All those other dense markets are up there in terms of bid. So any carrier with AWS One properties there, it's contiguous, and it adds capacity and the pipe really.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that because it does seem like, again, I kind of went back a little bit thinking about, the fact that, with in Europe back in 2000, 2001, they had the 3G auctions, which was spectrum that those carriers had to bid on if they wanted to offer 3G services. But at that time, the operators went crazy bidding on spectrum. I mean, there was, Germany, I think, was like $55 billion, and the UK was something like close to that as well. I mean, huge amounts of money, which seemed to cripple those operators' ability to roll out services. And now, they probably had some marketing issues. They did some, they kind of sabotaged themselves in other ways. But it seemed like that much money being spent on licenses kind of hampered their ability to really roll out services, which probably led to the U.S. perhaps leapfrogging Europe when it came to 3G services and even now LTE services. But I was thinking a bit, is this amount of money being spent? Is there a possibility that this could hamper the ability for the operators who've won these licenses to then now actually deploy these licenses? I mean, obviously the market's getting more competitive now. Price cuts are happening. They're getting pressured from the bottom now, and now maybe different ways of being pressured here. Is this going to have any sort of impact, you think, on deployment plans?
Yeah, it's a long-term play. So one of the things that a lot is has been written about and maybe not written about is the fact that the 1700 range is occupied currently by federal agencies. So the 20 to 2100 area is not. So there's going to be some spectrum sharing going on. And back in 2012, T-Mobile, through Neville Ray's conversation, and maybe Verizon and AT&T also have pushed for spectrum sharing because it's valuable property. So in the past, where you have an incumbent and they're going to be in there for a while, it's kind of reluctant to get into it. But to CTIA, the industry's efforts, and 4G Americas, they've pushed the FCC to look at spectrum sharing, and in the long term, once the federal agencies vacate, then it's free and clear. But part of it also is the transition plan to vacate. It's going to be at least 12 months of sharing in the 1700 band, and I saw, looking at the NTIA's transition plan, agencies go from anywhere from, I think, less than 12 months to all the way to 120 months.
Yeah, yeah.
120 months, that's 10 years.
Yeah.
12 months at least to do spectrum sharing. So that's a consideration. It's not like it's free and clear. A lot of people don't understand that once you make sure that it's got to be clear.
Yeah.
Back in Auction 66, AWS 1, you have to wait for a lot of clearing. So that's the consideration. And so I think there was a story on some vendors who say, hey, we're ready to go in 15, it's in the pipeline, and technically we're ready, it's up to the operators. Well, yeah, it is up to the operators how quickly they pull the trigger, as well as how long it's going to take to clear.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. They'll have plenty of time to kind of, I guess, get the funding that they needed. And obviously, it does seem like, too, with this spectrum, most of the operators that are participating in the current auction do own AWS 1 spectrum, so they're already using that spectrum. So it would seem to deploy this spectrum would be a fairly easy deployment. I mean, it's a channel card. It's, I'm guessing the antennas are probably the same types of antennas that can be used. So I'm guessing, cost-wise, it should not be much of an issue relative to like a greenfield type of build. So yeah, it should be a huge problem for them. But for some reason, when you see this amount of money being spent, at least for me, it was like, wow, I hope this doesn't hurt anybody down the road. But like you said too, they've got plenty of time to kind of work through the system here, and these companies are still making pretty good money. I mean, T-Mobile is probably the least money making, or if that's the right word for it, of the three big guys who are participating, and they're still doing pretty well. So they're definitely refilling the coffers pretty quickly to deploy the services too. So
I think that, at least when we're going back to the capital conversation, it's not like they're running out overnight, right? They don't need this right away. So a lot of carriers saying, hey, we're good for another couple of years, and this is all about the future.
Yeah.
And so it's clearing and going through the process of the ecosystem, whether it's the infrastructure side, the RAN side, the antenna side, whatever. I agree. It shouldn't be as great as a greenfield. I think from the ecosystem, you have to wait for it to get into the device side, right? And then so you have to wait for that. You also it's currently doesn't have assigned a band in 3GPP. How long that will take? It shouldn't take long, but I mean, you got to wait for the whole process, and the process is not trivial. It's not like you can get it, it's cleared, and boom, it goes on. Within months. There's some other issues you have to look at before you get service to.
Good point. Yeah, I think with AWS 1, I think T-Mobile won a lot of spectrum in AWS 1 auction, and I think it took them, I think it was like something like 3 years before they could even start rolling out anything at all in some of the markets. And even that was somewhat limited initially because of the interference and the sharing and stuff too. So yeah, it does take several years for the stuff to actually be out there. But like you said, they're planning for the future on this.
Well, also it's the ecosystem, right? So if you remember, they were the only game in town that kind of furthered it. No other big players were deploying that, right? Because AT&T and Verizon had the 700, so they were pushing their own. And then, as Verizon bought AWS 1 from the cable companies, it helped the whole ecosystem and drive down costs and cost sharing associated with the whole ecosystem. So looking towards the future, because Verizon, AT&T are there with T-Mobile amongst all the other riders, smaller guys will be in for the ride on in terms of scale.
Yeah.
For the ecosystem to kind of drive the cost down.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Now, obviously, the FCC is, once the auction ends, which should be any day here now, but usually the FCC has, I think it might take up to a week. What's that?
Any day?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to even predict at this point, but the FCC has a few days to announce who the actual winners are. And that'll be, I guess, the next step in this process is trying to figure out who won what, who's paid, who paid what where, because some of those licenses, especially the bigger ones, had pretty heated bidding there for a while. So it'll be interesting to kind of see what happened there. But once they announce the names, and I guess that becomes a point then where you try to, I guess, kind of put the pieces together. But looking at what's happening, I'm assuming that maybe you have the same assumption that it's probably the big guys who are probably driving most of this high-end bidding. I'm guessing the Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, to an extent maybe Dish. Have been
I was going to mention Dish. So we all know that those are AWS One operators, but there's also Dish, which is also next to AWS 4. Some of this stuff, right? So naturally, Dish is an interested party. The question is, will they have enough deep pockets to kind of go toe to toe with big guys? When it's all said and done, they're all going to trade anyway.
Yeah.
It's either going to be on the secondary market or swap here and there, and just so that they can get the right contiguous bands, as we've seen throughout the years with Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile have all traded AWS One stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. That'll be almost like the whole second part of this auction is once you get what you have, then you got to looking at the other guys' hands and see what they have, and then you start working out the deals. But yeah, that'll be a huge part of this. I'm guessing too. There were 70 companies or 70 names, entities that started this auction. I'm guessing a lot of these smaller guys. I mean, there might be some financial houses. There might be companies that just looking to at some point flip the spectrum anyway. At some point, which has become a common pastime in these auctions. So yeah, at some point this will become a bartering game. After a few years, once people figure out what's actually being used out there too. So not to bring up NextWave, but they're back in the PCS days, that was kind of one of the main drivers there. And at the end of the day, they just ended up selling off the licenses, and that was kind of it looks like that was kind of the whole plan to begin with. So.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the designated entities which get bidding credits. I'm sure there's some that are doing it on the behest of some carriers. What they are, we need to kind of peel back the onion to. But I'm sure a lot of designated entities are there for to kind of partner with some other carriers.
Yeah. I mean, carriers like U.S. Cellular, they've partnered a lot with King Street in the past, and various ones like that. Leap did too. Obviously, Leap is not participating anymore, but they partnered with some companies too. So yeah, I'm guessing those DEs are participating as well. So yeah, that's always kind of the after the fact. Once we see the names, you kind of start putting things together. See what happens there. Well, but again, now obviously this auction, like you said earlier, is going to have probably an impact on the incentive auction too coming up, and obviously that's the next one. Not to look too far ahead, but it does seem like the incentive auction has been there, and it's obviously been pushed back till 2016. But that's kind of the next big, I guess, auction event on the horizon. Looking at what's happening here, do you see any sort of impact now that we see the numbers being thrown out with this auction? That could impact the 600 megahertz. I mean, I know you mentioned already that it shows that carriers are willing to spend the money, but I guess beyond that, do you see any sort of impact of what's going on here on the next auction?
I think from raising money, it probably will be, given the trend, it's going to higher expectations from the government, from the broadcasters. I think from the general public, the media, not public, like they care, but the expectations who are looking at the next auction to help offset deficit, things like that.
Sure. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Or fund fuel rural broadband and other pet telecom projects. So it's only good, I guess, from the U.S. mobile broadband or the broadband standpoint.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of funds available to do things conceptually.
Yes, sure, yeah. I guess that'll be part of it too. But again, I guess looking at this a little bit, obviously the incentive auction does have a lot of hurdles ahead of it still. There's still a legal case going on. It seems like the FCC is still trying to get support from the broadcasters to get on board with this. Obviously with this amount of money being raised in the AWS auction, it could entice those broadcasters to maybe get on board. But I guess there could be the issue too. In some of the larger markets, from what I've seen and read in some stories, I mean, it seems like those markets are still profitable for these broadcasters to operate in. So again, it still seems like the incentive auction could have issues generating enough interest in those large markets. Obviously the smaller markets, I'm sure those guys are more than willing to give their licenses because it doesn't make as much sense to them. So it almost seems, to me, looking at this thing, that incentive auction could become almost not necessarily real market auction, but perhaps not include a lot of the bigger markets, which could be an interesting. It could have an impact on the eventual amount of money raised in the auction because again, no one's going to spend $3 billion on a license covering Nebraska like they would on covering New York City. So I don't know. I just from my own view looking at it, I don't know what sort of impact that could have on that incentive auction.
I think it's good because this is a reference bar. The 700 was a reference bar, and this quite frankly, it's going to be a lot of modeling going on. So
Yeah.
just because it's in a market now, it has certain assumptions associated with the price for that and how much operates. So it comes down to the modeling and what the revenue expectations are that the broadcasters consultants come in with and say, assuming this dollar is more profitable, is not profitable, but it comes down to business case studies and modeling, I think, and it might be market by market. So it's not necessarily, I don't think that it'd be foolish to kind of say, hey, right now at this snapshot in time, it's unprofitable, so we're not going to play. It comes down to a kind of modeling. I think that a prudent broadcaster would pay the bucks to kind of model.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense too. So, but again, that auction there, when that's once that finally comes online, that'll be a nice proof point. But I'm guessing too for the FCC, just the fact that this raised so much money, it definitely seems to release some of the pressure for them for that auction. Again, this thing has been kind of dragging on for the past couple of days, but I'm guessing too that for the FCC, they wouldn't mind if it dragged on, perhaps even into February, to perhaps overlap a bit more with the whole net neutrality debate going on, because that itself is going to draw a lot of perhaps negative attention to the FCC once that's finally announced, and being able to say, hey, but we generated $45 billion from this auction. Isn't that great? Look at us. Look how great we are.
Yes.
That'll be a nice thing for Wheeler to be able to put out there as well once the net neutrality issue becomes a little more public as well. So.
Yeah. So it's a good story for the FCC. It's going to be 2x what a lot of people, 2x or more, of what a lot of people projected. So it is a win. Yes.
Yeah, and it shows too. I mean, I know Wheeler at some of the past shows, kind of was stamping his feet, saying, "Hey, carriers, you need to show up at these auctions. We need to show the broadcasters that hey, we're serious." And at least for this auction, which isn't broadcast related, but it does show that the operators are willing to spend, whatever they can find between their seat cushions on spectrum. I mean, this is not it shows the money's there. So
True.
That's a positive part of it. Well, and again, I guess maybe look at this auction one more time, and not to bring up a specific carrier involved or not involved, but obviously, some operators, Sprint in particular, did not participate in this auction. Do you think, and obviously they've got their own issues going on, but do you think not participating in this and getting in on this ecosystem that seems to be supported by the other three big guys could impact a carrier like Sprint or any other carrier really that's not in this band? Could it impact their operations, do you think, at all going forward, or do you think that again, Sprint's got spectrum in various places. Maybe it won't be as huge of a deal, but do you think not getting in on this auction for those that did not participate might come back to haunt carriers at some point?
No, well, I mean, Sprint doesn't have any AWS properties, so from a technical standpoint, why spend money on stuff that it's really not strategic to overall? They've been criticized with having so many bands, right? Anyway, adding another band just complicates things, increases capex. So logically they shouldn't have participated. Yeah. There's no need for them to participate. I mean, it's just they're the odd man out in not having AWS assets, between the big four. So, but their eggs are in a different basket. Their eggs are towards the 600, which can give them more rural penetration in the long run. So. Personally, I think that was the right decision for those guys to do, and they'd probably be crucified if they participated in, yet another band that they have to support and put in service. So.
Yeah, and the way that the money got thrown around, it seems like in this auction too, it's probably smart for them at this point to not get caught up in this feeding frenzy of license at this point too. So it's probably a positive for them too. But again, once the names are released. Do you expect the big names to be the big drivers of this auction? I mean, do you expect AT&T, Verizon to be the ones that came out, spending probably half at least of the total money on this, and T-Mobile? I mean, what do you see, I guess, looking ahead maybe to next week whenever they announce the names?
So if I had to look at it, whoever has the most to gain to having contiguous spectrum and deep pockets will probably play well, and that's AT&T and Verizon. They have deeper pockets than T-Mobile. However, T-Mobile, in their quest to be the fastest carrier, want contiguous spectrum, and it's in their wheelhouse. So those guys are, I would expect, to be coming out the best winners. AT&T doesn't really have a national AWS footprint, so if the implication is that if they win it in a rural area and they don't have any AWS assets there, then that implies that they're going to have to, upgrade a base station here or there,
yeah,
and upgrade an antenna to account for that spectrum, antennae. And so that would generate a greenfield type of scenario.
Yeah.
They already have either PCS or 850 probably there anyway, so
Yeah.
it's not entirely greenfield, but at the same time, there's CapEx spend greater than if they already had assets there,
Yeah.
AWS assets.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see. I guess we'll see how that plays out there once the names are announced. But yeah, obviously once that part's announced, we can kind of see where everybody's at, and then the fun really begins on, like you said, kind of the second market trading of licenses, and then becomes a whole different story at that point too. So
yeah, I'm interested in seeing what happens, and so there's really a bunch of spectrum that's FDD, and there's a bunch that is TDD. I'm going to be interested in seeing what happens there, and I think I read a story that was for upload only and it's low powered, so that kind of diminished the value of that type of spectrum. So it'll be interesting to see, from a future standpoint, what will happen to that, whether it stays uplink or what, so that's the interesting techie geeky part.
yeah, that's a good point too, because it does seem like, the major draw or draw on networks right now is video, which for the most part can be a one-way type of transmission. Obviously LTE broadcast and things like that are being used. So yeah, if you can get your hands on perhaps even a one-way type of spectrum, that could, it seems like from watching the auction so far, those licenses have been perhaps a little less valued than the FDD type of spectrum. But again, looking forward, you're right. That spectrum seems like it could be an interesting play for a company that gets involved, or if a company under the radar picks up a bunch of those licenses, it could be a big play down the road for them, whether using it or selling it, or who knows.
Yeah, we don't know but spectrum always increases in value as time goes on, as if you sit on it, or whatever the case may be. But just a point that it's interesting, as you talk about a lot of download stuff. It's good from the industry standpoint, and they knew it anyway. All the tech people knew it, that the 2100 stuff is the downlink, whereas the in contention spectrum sharing stuff is the uplink.
Mm-hmm.
So which is the 17 stuff. So that's a good thing from a pure, uncluttered pipe. But then again, still, you still have to wait for clearing because it's FDD. You have to wait for the whole thing. So
yeah, it's gonna be definitely gonna be some a lot more runway on this than I think a lot of people perhaps, like you said, are expected or things can happen here. So it's gonna take a while for it all to play out. But again,
yeah. I think one more point is that I think the vendor community has said we're ready to go. We can be ready in early 16. Again, it could be as rosy as 16, but it depends on the carrier priorities. Again, it could be 16, late 16, early 17, or thereabouts. So it depends on what the carrier priorities are. And we'll find out after, I think, when it gets to 3GPP, who's shepherding and accelerating that effort to get band assignment and carrier aggregation. So that's kind of like what we're looking for, what I'm looking for in terms of a peep towards the future and who's doing what.
Yeah, well, maybe not that far ahead, but again, hopefully we'll see in the next week. This thing wraps up. We'll see who won what, and then we can maybe touch base again on kind of where we are when it comes to that. And obviously, it's the quarterly reporting season coming up as well, so there's be that part going on. So obviously a lot happening over the next couple of weeks in the telecom space. But Bill, we definitely appreciate the insight on this today. And like I said, hopefully this auction wraps up here soon. I don't want to say that I'm losing enthusiasm for it, but I'm ready for it to end at this point. 2 months is just about enough time, I think, for this. I think we're around 235 or 36 now, so I think that's plenty of time to. Yeah, that's plenty of time to decide on who's going to get what. So hopefully we'll see an injury soon. But again, Bill, definitely appreciate the time today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.